Hi everyone, and welcome to this CIWEM membership webinar, Ask a Professional Review Interviewer. My name is Barbara Orth. I am Senior Membership and Professional Standards Executive here at CIWEM, and I will be hosting today's session. And later on, I will be joined by Claire Rogers, a CIWEM professional reviewer, who has kindly agreed to join us today, join the conversation and share her experience, as well as any top tips regarding applications and interviews. Now, before we kick off, just a few general housekeeping rules. This event will be recorded, so the webinar is recorded and it will be made available on our website as well as on YouTube. So if you feel like you've missed anything along the way or you'd like to revisit any points that were made, please do make sure to check it out. It will be made available later on. If you do have any technical difficulties, please drop us a message and we will do our best to try and fix them. Now, this webinar will have a Q&A function, and we encourage everyone to make use of it. Send in any questions that you may have. This is really a fantastic opportunity to kind of get like the inside scoop, to ask Claire any direct questions that you may have. So yeah, do make use of the Q&A function. And finally, fantastic news, this webinar does contribute to 1 hour of CPD, so do make sure you record it in your CPD record because it does count towards it. Just to give a brief overview of the webinar and of the structure, it really is what it says on the tin. So essentially, we're going to be talking about the application process to become chartered with CIWEM, and we're going to be touching on both the written application process as well as the professional review interview part of chartership applications. I will have a brief presentation about the requirements of the application process, and as well as kind of what to expect from the interview once you get to it. And then we'll move on to kind of like a roundtable discussion with Claire, where she would join and share her top tips that she has kind of like accumulated as, you know, having been a professional reviewer with CIWEM. And then after that, we will open the floor to any Q&A activity from the audience. As I mentioned before, do send in your questions. We would love to hear from you. So just to jump straight in, for most applicants, becoming a chartered member of CIWEM, so this is our own bespoke chartered water and environmental manager membership grade, is usually a two-tier process. It involves a written application, and then if you're successful with your written application, then you will be invited to attend a professional interview. As part of your application to become a chartered member with CIWEM, you also have the opportunity to apply with any of the listed institutions here. So you can apply for incorporated engineer and chartered engineer with the Engineering Council, chartered environmentalist with the Society for the Environment, and chartered scientist with the Science Council. You can apply for both within the same application. They will be assessed, reviewed together, and I'll touch briefly on what this actually entails a little bit later. So just to give you a brief overview of kind of what a chartership application entails, I'm not going to be able to go into great detail about the requirements, individually. We do have webinars that we have dedicated to each requirement. So, if you're unsure and if you'd like to have a listen, then do make sure that you check them out. They're available on our website and on YouTube. But just to kind of have a brief overview, so your written submission must contain all of the following elements. So you will need an online application form, an up-to-date CV, any copies of relevant certificates. These must be signed by your sponsors. Very important, you must also have 2 chartered sponsors, one of which must hold C.WEM. The other sponsor can be chartered through another professional institution. You will also need to complete a 1,000-word career overview report, submit your training and CPD record for the last 3 years. This will require 90 hours of CPD to be recorded on a rolling basis. And the bulk of your application will be formed by the 4,000-word mandatory competence attainment report. This is kind of the most important element of your application, because this is really where we test and review your competence. And also, if you're applying via the work-based learning route, this is for applicants who do not meet the educational requirements. They will also need to complete a work-based learning statement form. Now, if you're also applying for any additional registrations, or the ones that I've mentioned previously, you will need to complete the additional mandatory competency report that comes with each of this additional registration. Just to give you an idea of, before we move on to the professional interview element of it, to give you an idea of kind of the timeline to expect from when you're applying. So you send in your application, we send the application off to trained assessors who will make their recommendation. Now, this recommendation will be reviewed by a professional standards committee who will ratify the outcome of your written application. And if you're successful, then you'll be invited for a professional review interview. The whole process shouldn't last longer than about 3 months if you're successful at each step of the process. And I think at this point of my presentation, I'm going to sneak in 3 tips from kind of our side, CIWEM side, so from a procedural perspective. And the first one, and these tips really relate to prior to submitting your applications, so things to consider before you submit. And the first one would be, do please make sure that you read the guidance. There's so much material and so many resources available, both on our website and on the online application portal. And these are there to help you get a better understanding of kind of what is expected, what we're looking for in an application. So make sure that you read the guidance. The second tip would be, before you send in an application, before you submit the application, please make sure that it is complete and that is up to scratch, that you have met all the requirements, that you have all the necessary elements. We do give you the opportunity to submit any missing information, but this just might mean that there's a delay in processing your application, and it might mean that your application will be deferred to the next cycle. So do make sure that your application is complete before you submit. And finally, we recruit is the wrong word to use here. So we accept and process applications on a rolling basis. Sorry, not on a rolling basis, on a cyclical basis. That means that we have an application deadline every 2 months, following which we review the application sent in. These are also listed on our website. So if you'd like to have your application reviewed within a particular timeframe, do make sure that you look at the deadline to make sure that you meet it and to avoid any future disappointment. Okay, so as I've mentioned briefly previously, once your written submission has passed assessment, you will be invited to a professional review interview. But obviously, because of the pandemic, recently we have conducted all our interviews remotely via Zoom. We will be looking to return to face-to-face interviews at some point, not sure when, but typically the structure of a professional review interview is as follows. There are introductions, you'll be introduced to the panel, you can introduce yourself, then you will move on to your career overview, where you have the opportunity to tell the interview panel about, how you have gotten and progressed to your career point where you find yourself at the moment. In advance of the professional interview, you'll be required to present a 10-minute presentation. This won't be interrupted, and we do ask that you keep to the time limit, because if you do go over, then the interview panel will ask you to stop the presentation. Now, at any point, even after your career overview report, after your 10-minute presentation, you can expect to have questions from the interview panel based on the information provided. And after the presentation is over, the panel will then move on to the mandatory competencies from your written submission and ask you questions from there. I think that pretty much sums up the process. As I've mentioned, if you have any questions, then do send them in. I think at this point, I am going to invite Claire to join the conversation. Just as a brief introduction, Claire is a Chartered Fellow of CIWEM, as well as a Chartered Environmentalist and Chartered Scientist with a passion for leading and developing others and a strong desire to protect and enhance the water environment. She currently leads the Environment Agency's National Environment Assessment and Sustainability Team for Yorkshire and North East England. Since becoming chartered with CIWEM in 2014, she has been actively involved in the Tyne and Humber Committee, organising and delivering workshops and professional membership with the Water Framework Directive. She regularly mentors others to produce successful CIWEM membership applications, including through the CIWEM Mentor platform, and has published a series of articles on LinkedIn sharing advice for chartership applicants. As a reviewer, she has interviewed applicants for chartership from a range of backgrounds, both in person and via the new remote professional review interview process. Welcome, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us today and for agreeing to share your experience.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you okay. I can't see you though.
Every time I click start video, it says you can't start your video because the host has disabled it.
Oh, so sorry. Right. Let me see if I can fix that.
Go. Yeah, that should work now. Hello. Hi, everyone.
Fantastic. Hi. We managed to fix that rather quickly. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned, I think I'm just going to dive straight in and ask you to put on your assessor hat and kind of start off with, you know, what I think the question we're all wondering is like, what makes a good application? So when you look at an application, what kind of makes you go, this is chef's kiss?
I think the single thing that makes the biggest difference in written applications and in interviews is if someone's had a mentor. And that does often really shine through. And a mentor can be someone, ideally someone who's been through the process with CIWEM before, but because they will help you to make the best of yourself. And to really focus what you write against the requirements that the panelists are asking for. So I really, it's like my one tip. my top tip is to make sure that you do have a mentor to help you with that. I mean, you'll need sponsors anyway, so it's part of that. I think the other thing that really comes across, and this is true for interviews and for written applications, is that you need to talk about yourself. We say this a lot, but just really watch in a written application. It's quite easy because you can search for it. Just search for the word we, and every time you see it, delete it. And I do this when I review stuff all the time, you know, just highlight it in yellow, because the thing to bear in mind about chartership applications, in a sense, it's a bit like a job application. You know, you're presenting yourself, you're saying who you are, and you're trying to make a case for you. But in another sense, it's quite different because you're not competing against different people. You're just demonstrating whether or not you met this bar. And it's not about you know, what the team you've worked in has done, what the organisation you've worked in has done. It's just about what you've done. And that is so important, and it's something that I and my fellow reviewers, you know, we talk about and we struggle with all the time. The worst applications are the ones where people say, I was in this massive team and we did this and we did this and it was really impressive, and we're like, great, I'm very happy for your team. What did you do? What was different because you were there? And so a good application has the word I in it lots of times. And that is very counterintuitive, and it's very weird and hard to do. So when people start to do it, and this is where a mentor is helpful, or just, you know, a friend or a colleague, really get them to say, okay, but what did you do? What was your involvement in this? You know, give the context. You know, no one's pretending you did the work on your own. It's fine to say, look, I worked in a team of 5 people. I reported to this guy. This is where I made the influence. I was responsible for this part of the work. As a result of my input, we had these improvements. We worked this way better. This is a challenge that came up that I dealt with. So it's just bringing that back to yourself and your involvement. And the last thing I'd say is about covering all the competencies. So the analogy I like with the what that bar is for chartership is that it's a bit like a driving test. You have to demonstrate that you are competent across the field, across the board, in all the different areas, so that you can be trusted to go out on your own. That's the level that we expect for chartered. But a bit like a driving test, you know, it's not enough to be able to change gears if you can't use your wing mirrors. You've got to be able to meet all 14 mandatory competencies. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. It's quite a broad church in CIWEM, so some of the questions we ask are quite broad, but you need to meet the bar for all of them. And if there's some, you know, this is, you know, if you're in an early stage of looking at this, it's a fantastic exercise and a great way of mapping out where you are in your job and what things you may need to just do a bit more of to get a bit more experience of. So know yourself where your weaknesses are, but really focus on and work on how to demonstrate your capabilities in that area. Some questions will be easy for you and some will be harder, but you need to meet the bar across the board. And that's what people fail on. Yeah.
Fantastic. Just to jump on the idea that you've already mentioned before is, you know, the requirement for a mentor and, you know, how important the sponsor is. Do you find that, you know, so some applicants tend to kind of like treat the sponsor requirement as kind of like a tick? You know, it's another thing that you need in the application. Obviously, we do require sponsors to read through the application, but it's really important for them to actually do it and to provide useful tips. Yes. And I think another thing that a question that we get quite frequently is how many projects would you recommend people use in the mandatory competencies? Like how many examples?
Yeah, both great questions. So the role of a sponsor, you're right, that's quite an interesting one because a sponsor can be a mentor can be a sponsor, but I would see those as quite different things. So a sponsor, you need, I think two sponsors? Ideally, that would be someone who's familiar with your work and who's qualified to the relevant standard. Now, those aren't always people who have the time and the knowledge and the best place to actually help you bring out the best in yourself in a form. They should still read your application, but sometimes that can be more challenging. So I think the main thing is to have somebody who knows you and ideally who knows a bit about the chartership process with CIWEM, who can help you to bridge the gap between here I am, here's what I can do, and here's what I need to demonstrate for chartership. The project question is a great one. I think we talk about, you know, what is competence? Often, I think the guidance even says this, as a rule of thumb, we ask for about 2 examples for each competence. And the reason for that is that it gives us that confidence that you have that competence in that area. And I would really recommend that you read the competence guidelines because often they ask for a lot. So there's one, for example, on initiating and managing change. Well, those can be 2 different things. You might have one good example where you initiated a change and another one where you managed change. So 2 examples gives you the right level of breadth and also lets you get into the depth of you know, what you did in that particular example. I think the other thing I'd add there, sometimes we get asked, you know, how old can the project examples be? I think what I would say is it's all part of you. Everything you've done is part of you. So if you've got some great examples that were 10 years ago, yes, you can add those in. I think this is where the 2 examples thing comes in. It's about getting that balance right. If all of your examples that you're giving are 10 years old, then I, as an assessor, am thinking, what has this person been doing in the last 10 years? You know, you're showing yourself at your best. And that's only really possible if you're showing a mix of examples from across your career. But absolutely, you know, if the strongest thing you did in a particular area was some time ago, I think that's fine. Just try and balance it with something that's a bit more recent.
Fantastic. And just to follow on that idea, so say if someone is applying for chartered membership and then also an external registration, sometimes the mandatory competencies tend to overlap a little bit, but then as an assessor, you're looking for like different answers for the competencies. So what would your recommendation be to kind of avoid the copy and paste, you know, instinct?
I think the first thing to say there is it's all you. So, and yes, some of the competencies do sound pretty similar. So I don't think you should be going out of your way to make up extra stuff that demonstrates your best skills in a particular area for the 2 forms. You can use the same examples, but I would just make sure that you read what those competencies are actually asking for in a reasonable amount of detail, because there are differences between them. And assessors do hate copy and paste for that reason, that they aren't quite tailored enough to that example. It is fine to reuse examples. I think generally across the board, it's something to avoid is relying too heavily on 1 or 2 examples throughout all of the competency questions. Because again, if someone says to me, look, I worked on this one impressive project and that's all I've done for my career to date, it depends on the type of job, but you know, if you've been working in a consultancy environment with multiple projects, it raises the question to me about why is that the only thing you've done that's impressive? You know, surely there'll be other things there. So it's breadth and depth. That's how you demonstrate that you are competent in that area.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. In the meantime, we've also received a question from the audience. I'm just going to read it out for you. Do you need to state when you worked on a project? So, for example, 2018. just thinking of the word limit.
I see. Only 2 words to say in 2018. I mean, you have already given your CV and your career overview, so the actual details of the project are covered in that. The competency, you don't have to give the year, you don't have to say when you did it, but it just helps the assessor to fit that into the CV and the career overview that they've read about you. I think the most important thing to say in your competency, though, is that we talk a lot about the STAR framework. So, you know, you'll get this a lot for interview practice, but, you know, what was the context? What was the specific task you engaged with, and what was the result? And often as part of that context exercise, it is helpful to say, you know, this is approximately when it was, this is who the work was for, this is the team I was working in. But the one criticism I most commonly make, apart from people saying way too much, is that there's too much context, because the context is all about where the area within which you're working, and often it's about the work other people are doing. We're not assessing the work other people are doing. So if you find that your context is like half the example, I'm going to be putting a big line through that if I was reviewing it. You need to keep the context to a page, to a sentence or two. But often the year is something that's quite easy to add within that, I would say.
And just to kind of take a step back from the competencies, as there are other elements to the written submission as well. We often get applicants a bit confused in terms of what to include in the career overview report, and, you know, whether there's like a template. We usually don't have a template because it's tailored to each individual and each individual's career progression. But what are kind of your tips for a good career overview report?
That's a good one. I think about what would help you get across your career nice and clearly, because, you know, I think you have to submit a CV as well. When I did it, it was either or. But what I found helpful for me personally was actually to present it as a table. So I had, you know, the years in and the kind of key responsibilities, and I used the headings from the guidance to do that. And that's fine, you know, it doesn't have to be prose. And I mean, anything that improves readability is useful. So, you know, use headings, use subheadings, use a table if that makes sense for you. But really look at the guidance in terms of what they're asking for, because the career overview report is not, can you copy and paste your CV into a different format? It's, do you show that kind of reflective view? You know, how are you developing and learning? Why are you moving from one job to another? Why did you get that responsibility? Was it something that you were interested in and you liked doing? And what did you take from it? And how did that feed into the next thing? So it's much more about telling that kind of story, whereas a CV is much more kind of formulaic. You know, I did this and blah blah blah, and I did this blah blah blah. So I would encourage you to really look and digest the guidance around that, but do think about formats that just make it easy and simple to read, much as you would for your CV as well.
Fantastic. And just before we move on to kind of the interview element of the process, so for example, say if someone unfortunately isn't successful at the first time applying and they are asked to resubmit their written submission, what would you recommend to those applicants?
This is something I've just been helping someone with recently, actually. So you will get feedback from CIWEM. So really take the time to read and to process and to understand that feedback. If you have questions on it, you can ask them. You know, there's only so much that the membership team might be able to do to dig into that. I would recommend at that point getting a mentor, and I know that's something the membership team often recommend as well. It might be useful to get someone different to help you with that than someone who helped you with your mate, you know, when you did it initially. And if you didn't have someone help you initially, then it's a good idea to try and reach out to someone, you know, look in your networks, type CIWEM into LinkedIn and see who you might have had contact with, who's a member or chartered member, and ask them to help you out. And have a look at what tends to happen is that we say, you know, you failed these 1 or 2 competencies. So, you know, by all means take the opportunity to update some bits of it, but really just focus on those competencies. Try and understand what the issue was with what you wrote there, and adapt it, whether that's, you know, often that's something like you need to use a better example, or what you said there didn't really go far enough. The feedback you get should really help you to do that.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we're okay to move on to the interview part of the process. Now, would you like to kind of kick us off with some of your more general tips, or shall I read out some Q&As from the audience? It's entirely up to you.
Yeah, I can dive in. I mean, I think just to tie the two together, anything you write in your written application is fair game for interview. And, you know, just knowing your luck, it'll be, you mention a project and someone else is like an expert in that area or has worked on that site for decades or whatever. Don't put stuff in that you can't comfortably talk about in a reasonable amount of detail. You know, this is not one for bluffers out there. You know, just put in things that you really feel confident about. So interview tips. Again, CIWEM interviews, you know, they're not like normal job interviews. You're trying to meet the bar. You know, everyone who's interviewing you, they really want you to pass. That, you know, they really want to support you. So it's not, you know, it's not like we can only admit so many people. If you meet the bar, then you qualify. So don't panic. You know, if you've got to interview, that's brilliant. Well done. You know, that's a really good step. And, you know, if issues come up, especially when we're doing them online, if you get technical issues or whatever, it's no problem. Practice talking about yourself. Standard interview advice, but practice talking about yourself. Practice using that I term. Practice saying, I did this, I did that. You know, and just practice doing that kind of fairly succinctly if you can. I think I would like to just talk briefly the project presentation. So the 10-minute presentation, it is 10 minutes. We do cut you off after 10 minutes. That's a fairness thing. It's about allowing us enough time to do other things. So, you know, do stick to that. You asked earlier about the number of project examples. For the project presentation, please only use one example. It is very hard to give the right level of depth if you're going into several projects. It can be done, but it is so difficult. It's much more straightforward to pick one project that shows kind of you at your best, a full range of things that the mandatory competencies cover, and to dive into that. So use one project and really, really focus on what you did in it. Yes, give a bit of context. But again, when I review people's presentations, I'm like, you took 5 minutes of that was about why you got the work. It's why the organisation got the work and what the drivers were for it. It's great you understand that, but we're not assessing that. We're assessing you. So yeah, go easy on the context. It's not like a presentation at a conference. So it's very unusual in that sense. You know, in a conference, you would never stand up and say, hey, here's all the stuff I did. You would be talking about your organisation and your team. This is the opposite of that. You don't want to be talking about your organisation or your team really at all. It's about you, what you did, the context within which you work, the challenges you faced, the things you achieved. And that's the one thing that we always say, the one criticism that we often have of people who in their presentations, they don't talk about themselves enough. And it's hard and it's counterintuitive. So you have to prepare it and you have to practice it.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in and throw some audience questions at you, if that's okay, Claire. We've got some fantastic ones. So the first one is, in the interview, if asked about a specific competence, should you focus on the examples provided in the written submission, or can you introduce additional project examples?
It's all you, so you can talk about whatever you like. Hang on. Generally, if I'm asking about it, I like to see an example other than what's written. And often if I'm asking about it, it's because what's written isn't quite enough. So I like it when people give other examples. That said, if that is your best example for that thing, or maybe, you know, your only example with that thing, then, you know, don't feel that you can't talk about things that are in your written submission. It's all part of who you are and what makes you qualified. But if you have some additional examples, or also some more up-to-date examples, because a lot can happen in 3 months before you get your interview, you know, by all means bring those in, because often they will be, you know, they'll be fresh in your mind, they'll be relevant. Hopefully they'd be, you know, a level up from what you were doing 5 or 10 years ago. So just use the best one that reflects you.
Excellent, thank you. A next great question is specifically relating to competence A1, which we know is kind of, yeah. Yeah, so I understand an element of the interview is likely to focus on awareness of wider environmental issues. Please, can you talk a bit about that and the depth of knowledge awareness that is expected? Thank you.
Yes, so the reason I laughed when you said A1, again, as interviewers, this is one that people disproportionately struggle with. And the reason for that is that A1 is all about your general environmental and awareness of the water and environment industry. And for some people, that is really hard. You know, if they are amazing technical experts, they don't necessarily, you know, look up and have that context. What we're asking for there is, if this person introduced themselves at a conference or something as a chartered water and environment manager, do they have an informed opinion about any given sort of big environment and water management topics other than their particular specialism? That's all we're after. You know, do you have that wider awareness? So if you work in flood risk, do you have some awareness of biology, you know, of sort of river biology or water quality or something? I mean, if you work in try to find another example, if you work in modeling, do you have an awareness of climate change? You know, do you understand the context within which your work fits? Do you have, and it's not about having like the right opinions, it's much more about, you know, do you have informed opinions? You know, read the paper, read the CIWEM magazine, just have you thought about environmental stuff? And I think, you know, I'd much rather, to give an example that I've heard, I'd much rather do an interview with someone where I ask about renewable energy and they say, oh, actually, I think some of these renewable energies are rubbish. And they, you know, because they don't do this and they don't do that. I really like this one, but I don't like that one. It's an informed opinion. I'd much rather have that than someone who goes, renewable energies are good and we should do more of them. It's that, you know, think about it and have an opinion.
Yes, I smiled as well when I read A1, because yes, it is one of those competencies that is kind of the boogeyman, isn't it? Just quickly moving on to the next question. I think I'm going to have a stab at answering it first before passing it on to you, because it does have kind of like a process element to it, and it is assessors are allocated at are assessors allocated at random, or are they chosen based on matching experience to the applicant's line of work? So in terms of what we try to do is, yes, we do try to match the assessor's experience to the applicants. Obviously, this also depends on interviewer availability, because all of this work is done by volunteers, and obviously we can't expect everyone to be available all the time. Now, that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that the interview is competence-based, but it's not a technical interview. Claire, if you could add something more to that, is in that it is competence-based, but it's not specifically related to like technical elements of your job.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it depends. If you've spoken to someone who used to mentor a few years ago, I think originally when we had face-to-face interviews, we put a lot of time and effort into pairing people by technical expertise. But actually, I think there's a good argument now, with the amount of training that assessors and interviewers go through, that anyone who is themselves chartered and who has been through the training process is competent to interview you for that qualification. The exception is about getting the panel balanced right for things like if you go for chartered engineer, at least 2 of your panelists will be chartered engineers. But other than that, in theory, anyone from any background can interview you for chartered water and environment manager, provided they themselves have that qualification and they've done the training. And I guess that's actually a really important point, because I would absolutely approach the interview as if you're being interviewed by intelligent people who don't work in your technical area. So I'm at the Environment Agency here, watch your acronyms, and you know, just be very very aware that you might not be speaking to someone who understands exactly the kind of processes you might be talking about. So it's almost a non-technical presentation, in the sense that you don't want to assume a great deal of technical knowledge in your audience, because they're often quite a mix. What often, I must say, in my experience, what tends to happen is that you'll get maybe 1 or 2 people who really know your area really well, and some people who don't know it at all, which is quite good for the candidates, because then you can, you've got someone covering all those areas. But really, at a basic level, you need to be pitching what you're saying at someone who knows a lot about the water and environment management sector, but maybe doesn't know a lot about the specific area you work in. So be prepared to explain it to that kind of audience, if that helps.
Absolutely. We also have another question that we've kind of touched on a little bit earlier on, and it's regarding kind of like overlapping competencies. And this is specifically regarding chartered environmentalist. And the question reads, in the past, when I have looked at this, the competencies appeared to be mapped quite closely to C.WEM. Has this changed? Do the responses need to be adapted? accordingly?
I think they should be tweaked. I would be very wary of giving exactly the same answers. Where the competencies map very closely, I think it's fine to use the same examples, but just bear in mind that the questions being asked are different, and just look at what those differences are. And because CIWEM and the Society of the Environment are different organisations, and they look for slightly different things.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Another question that you've also kind of touched on, and it relates to the presentation, and specifically, what are assessors, interviewers looking for applicants to demonstrate as part of the presentation in the interview?
Okay, so we're only looking for you to demonstrate one thing, and that's your competence across all the 14 that you meet the bar across all 14 competencies. So the more of that you can demonstrate through your project presentation, the better. Some of the best presentations actually begin with someone saying, I picked this project partly because I enjoyed it. That's always nice. But because it demonstrates a few of the key competencies here. So this one, because I did this, it demonstrates B1, because I did this, it demonstrates B3, because I did this, blah, blah, blah. And that way they really tie it into the competency that the project relates to. It's also a nice way of kind of explaining a bit more about yourself and going into that detail on one particular piece of work that you did. And often we'll pick up other competencies from it.
I think this ties in excellent with another question that we have, which is, does the presentation in the interview need to hit all the competencies?
No, that would be, gosh, that would be, to fit that in 10 minutes, no thank you. I mean, you've submitted a written application, right? And that has covered, and that's been accepted. So that means you've more or less met the bar for all the competencies. You know, you have to do that to get to that point. The interview is an extra layer on top of that to really delve into some of those specific competencies. You can have a think about, you know, is there a particular project that stands out for you that demonstrates some competency more strongly than others? If you notice that there's a particular weakness in your written application with a few competencies, but you've got a project that addresses those ones specifically, you know, that's brilliant. If you've got, if you know that you relied very heavily on one example in your written application, but you want to give a project example that's different to that, that might be quite good just to demonstrate that breadth. Again, a mentor or just an extra person to speak to about that when you're looking at what projects you might touch on can be extremely helpful.
Excellent. We've got another very good question. If asked a question that you don't feel able to answer or feel maybe an area of weakness, how do you recommend responding in that situation?
Ooh, standard interview situation. First off, interviews aren't perfect. People freeze in the headlights. People who are experts in a certain thing suddenly have a complete brain melt and can't think of what to say. That's fine. We're used to dealing with that as interviews. It's one of the things we're trained for. It's fine to say, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. Could you repeat the question, or could you phrase it in a different way? That's often a good way to start. You know, is it just that you've not quite got what they're getting at? And the interviewers will, if you're struggling, they will follow that up and try to expand a bit so that you understand what they're asking. I think if it's an area that you genuinely know nothing about, please don't pretend that you know stuff about it. The interviewers will be able to spot that. And I think in some cases, you know, if you genuinely don't know anything about a particular thing, you can say what you do know in that sort of related area. It's also okay to say, look, I'm really sorry, I don't know anything about that particular thing. Do you have any other questions of that type that maybe you could ask? Or, you know, we will do that. If you said that particular area isn't something I know much about, they'll move on to another question that might tackle the same competency, or we'll ask it in a different way. Yeah, and definitely doesn't mean you failed the interview. Some of our questions can be quite weird.
Excellent, thank you. Quickly relating to sponsors, we have a question. Claire said that your sponsors would ideally be familiar with your work. How essential is this? And this is particularly, I'm assuming, because the applicant or the person who asked this doesn't know any people within their organization who are members of CIWEM, chartered members of CIWEM, and therefore they may connect with someone remotely for them to sponsor.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, a mix is good. You know, if you can have like one person who knows your work and they can talk to someone else, then that would be ideal. I think you might be surprised. You know, if you, as I say, if you have a look through things like LinkedIn contacts, or even your email address for people with like C.WEM or CEnv or something in their email footer. You might be surprised which of your contacts do have links like that. I mean, shameless plug here, but if you're already involved with CIWEM in some way in your local committee or something like that, then that can be quite a good way to get to know people who can become sponsors. I think you know, a sponsor has to be someone who's comfortable writing a letter saying, I know this person and I support their application. So I think if there's someone that you don't know before you start writing your application, then they do need to be involved in talking to you about it, in reviewing it, so that they know you enough to feel comfortable putting their name against your name.
Fantastic. Quickly jumping onto the next question. Can you refer to any paperwork during the interview? So your career overview report, written submission, CIWEM code of conduct, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, you absolutely can. I mean, your interviewers might well refer to it because we'll all have read all of it. And, you know, that's something else to watch out for. It tends to be the other way around, that we tend to say, oh, in the third paragraph of your second thing, you wrote this. Could you tell us more about it? It's fine to say in an interview that you've referred, that you know, there's more detail given in a written thing. But in general, you know, the written work has got you to the interview. And then the interview is looking at where the gaps are. So if they're asking you about something that's also that you think is covered in your written application, you might need to go further than that. Because the reason we're asking you that question is that what you've written probably isn't quite enough. And then we're just asking for a little bit more breadth or a little bit more depth to give us confidence that you really understand that topic. Excellent.
Moving on to another contentious element of the application, which is CPD. And the question is, does CPD, the submission, does it need to map to competency or not?
Well, that's probably one for you. I don't think it does. No.
So it's no. So really, what we're looking for is, in a CPD record is so what we always tell applicants is that rather than just thinking of a CPD record as a list of items that you've done, like activities that you've undertaken and the hours that you've undertaken, we also require like a reflective element to a CPD record. So kind of you to reflect on what you have gained from said CPD activity, and also a future planning element. And what we mean by this is kind of how you plan to apply the undertaken CPD in your line of work. So these are really key elements to the CPD record. Other than that, 3 years, 90 hours over 3 years, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add to that, it's almost the other way around in terms of the competencies. There's one competency that specifically relates to CPD, and that's where this reflective piece comes in. I think a lot of people in the written application just say, you know, see CPD log. It's nice to see a bit more than that. It can absolutely be a shorter bit because you have already provided a CPD log, but it's that narrative. You know, I'm passionate about CPD. That's why and as you can see in my CPD log, I've done 100 hours over the last 3 years. Particular highlights for me have included going to this conference, giving this presentation, doing this, having this mentoring relationship. And it's just a way of telling a bit of a story against something that is kind of more of a table. And it just is a chance to show how you do that reflective practice. So most people have an annual appraisal process where as part of that they reflect on how much training they've done and what they like to do in future and what's worked and what hasn't. So something that shows that you're not just doing CPD for the sake of it, but that you're thinking about it, you're getting the training that you want and need, and that you're applying it, and in particular anything that shows that you're starting to get to that point where you're working independently and you're actually helping to train others, is particularly strong. You know, it's that driving test analogy. Are you competent enough to work on your own, or even potentially to help other people with their work? You know, that's the kind of thing that really helps to demonstrate that competency with confidence.
Excellent. We have 2 more questions left, so I'm just going to urge the audience members, if they do have any questions, do send them in now. Otherwise, if you also remember something, you know, you go away, you've listened to the webinar and you remember something this afternoon, do email the membership team. The email address is membership@ciwem.org. We are usually quite good at replying and getting back to everybody. So if you do have any additional questions, then do make sure to email us or call us, either whichever works for you. A rather specific question, which reads, I work in wastewater field, wastewater field and lack design experience. Do you think this is a disadvantage for applying for chartership?
if you're applying for chartered engineer, I think that probably is true. I think for C.WEM, so for chartership with CIWEM, a lack of design experience in and of itself is not an issue, but there might be some competencies that you might struggle with around the analysis of data and so on. So I'd recommend that you have a look at that and feel confident answering those. But competencies are different for different qualifications, so do check that. You can apply for a chartered member of CIWEM without applying for chartered engineer, but you can't apply for chartered engineer without also applying for C.WEM.
Perhaps this is also a good question to ask your sponsor, because they will be able to, they would know your experience and what is required specifically, and they'd be able to guide you through this question. Moving on to the next question, I'm happy to answer this as well, Claire, if you'd like me to, is how long is the timescale between doing your professional interview and finding out if you have been successful? So essentially what happens, you come in, you have your professional interview. Within about 2 weeks, the CIWEM executive emails you with an informal outcome of your professional interview. This decision will then be ratified by the Professional Standards Committee. This usually happens about 3 weeks following your interview, and then after the Professional Standards Committee has ratified the decision of the interview panel, you will receive the official outcome. If you've been successful, then you will receive your certificate, a welcome letter, etc. And if you've not been successful, unfortunately, then you will receive a very detailed feedback letter from the interview panel. I think I've covered everything. Claire, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's all. I would have said that.
Okay.
And we say that in the interview as well, in case you forget.
Yeah. And we've got also got one final question. Should presentations be mostly text, pictures, diagrams, or a mix of both?
I was just about to come on to this, actually. So it's standard good practice for slideshows. And honestly, if you're nervous about it, just Google it for ideas. A 10-minute presentation does not need more than 10 slides. Keep it fairly short. Focus on, I would say pictures tend to be better, and just a very minimal amount of text. Remember, people can read faster than they can hear, so lots of dense text is always a terrible idea. Some people, myself included on this call, will be using their phones, so they might not be able to read very detailed text. Not too much stuff in detail, but it's a nice way of illustrating what you're doing. If you worked on a particular site, then pictures of that site are really useful. If you're working on more of a strategic piece, then some sort of organograms, pictures of kind of meetings you're involved with. Appreciate if they're online, that might not be so interesting. And also, some sort of organogram that shows where you fit within the team structure. It's fine to include something like that. Personally, I love the visual, so I think that's a good idea. Just practice it so you're not sort of constantly reading off notes. But yeah, don't be tempted to just dump everything in there. Short, succinct bullet points and plenty of pictures. That's the way to go.
Excellent, thank you. I think those have been all our audience questions. Claire, do you have any final tips, thoughts that you would perhaps like to share with everyone?
I think the main thing is just, I guess there's two final points from me. One is to just get started. If you think you'll get around to it at some point, you won't. So pick a deadline. I think you said it really nicely yourself. The deadlines are all online, so just pick one and work towards it. And then if everything falls over and you end up having to go for the next one, that's fine. But it's good to aim for one, just to keep you focused and to ensure that you make time for it, because these things, it does take time to write these applications, and we really, really appreciate that. But it's important that you invest that time in it, because you're investing in yourself and your qualification. So pick a deadline and work towards it, and find someone who can support you with that journey. And then the final thing I would say, I'll say to everyone, is once you've passed your interview, which I'm sure everyone on this call will, don't stop there. Think about what else you can do for CIWEM. Do get involved in the various groups and things. If after a reasonable period of time, when the panic's died down, you think, actually, I quite like the sound of interviewing, then do look into that. Do put yourself forward. I love being an interviewer. You get exposure to all different parts of the business. You get to learn from people who do all kinds of amazing jobs in the area that you would never even have thought existed. It's a really lovely way to get to know other people, other panelists. That was always my favourite thing when we met face to face, the kind of chats over lunch. which we're sort of looking to duplicate, but it's a bit harder without the free sandwiches. But yeah, please do think about continuing to get involved in the organisation, and mentor and support other people who are going through the process you're going through now, because I'm sure you'll appreciate how much the help others can give benefits you. So yeah, pay that forward.
Excellent. I think that is a fantastic note to end the webinar on. Again, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us today and for taking the time to share your experience. To everyone listening, I've mentioned this before, I'm going to say it again. If you do have any additional questions, then do please email us and we will get back to you. I hope this webinar has been instructive. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.